Thank you very much for coming. By the way, my wife is in the office and she decided it's too cold to come. Anyways, I will talk to you today about a project I'm working on, a book project that I am working on. I am going to talk to you about today not about how modern Standard Arabic developed, but about what makes it so difficult for us historians of Arabic to find out how and indeed if modern Standard Arabic is a development from Classical Arabic. All what we have managed since the beginning of the 20th century up to now is to devise a term to label the Arabic language that we see in writing and in some other formal functions as modern Standard Arabic. It runs in a field that modern Standard Arabic, structurally speaking, is not any different from Classical Arabic. But it's called modern Standard Arabic. Now, we can actually see part of the problem about the definition of modern Standard Arabic and or its structural development from one such simple and funny example. This is a Facebook formula that everybody in the Arab world now uses, which is very interesting. See, in English, that moment, and this is Arabic, so you would imagine, because it is written, it's modern Standard Arabic, this is no problem English, and then you would also imagine that this is also modern Standard Arabic. Well, you're right, that moment is good English. And this line summarizes the whole problem of the modern Arabic situation. لما امك تسألك عملت ايه في الامتحان؟ You feel like امتحان دي كانت محنة. Okay. Now, this is modern Standard Arabic. This is Damascus Arabic word. This is ambiguous. This is ambiguous. This is Egyptian Arabic. And this is a prepositional phrase that is ambiguous. I'm going to explain soon. This is English. This is modern Standard Arabic, no doubt. This is Egyptian Arabic. This phrase is modern Standard Arabic. Now, in translation, that moment when your mother asks you what you did in the exam, you feel like, exam? It wasn't an exam. It was catastrophe. Okay. Now, this template can be traced to an Algerian Facebook webpage. And it was taken throughout the Arab world. It always stays that moment blank. You feel like you put whichever picture that fits and then your comment. Another example, I'll come back to these examples again. Beautiful Arabic calligraphy, right? This is استرجل وعيش single. So in translation, man up and live single. Don't get married. Okay. استرجل is form 10 perfect imperative modern standard Arabic form. وعيش is an Egyptian Arabic imperative. Single is an English one. Right? These two are funny examples of what modern standard Arabic data is. A historian of a language takes data pauschal, like we say in German, takes data as is, and makes an analysis. This is by no means eccentric or, well, extreme borrowing or mixture. This is what we say every day, what we use every day, and this is a very common language. You can also see this in news websites. This is a problem for defining what modern standard Arabic is. From the beginning of the 20th century, especially 1912, the first definition of modern standard Arabic came. And that definition came from a French colonial educator in Algeria who defined modern standard Arabic simply as any kind of written Arabic intended for written communication. All forms of spoken Arabic are not modern standard Arabic. That definition worked very fine in colonial Algeria because they wanted to just simply have a definition for what they should teach at schools. But this definition stayed with us because it made a very vague, but at the same time quite prominent distinction in the Western linguist's mind between the written form and the spoken form. The written form is modern standard Arabic, one feature of which is that it sticks to the rules of classical Arabic that you can find in medieval Arabic grammar books. Easily defined, fine. That form cannot be used in spoken language. This definition has been challenged in 1959, of course, by Charles Ferguson in his problem of an article, diglossia. Charles Ferguson decided that yes, there is a standard form that enjoys prestige, which he called a high form, and all the dialects that do not enjoy that prestige, and he defined the high, the H form, and the low, the L form, functionally. And he gave examples for the functional or communicative situations in which you must use standard Arabic forms, and the functions and situations you must not use standard Arabic forms. In this definition of Ferguson's, there is a connection between the structural form of modern standard Arabic, which one can get from the books of Arabic grammar, as I said before, and the functions in real life. Some of these functions are, of course, literature, all written functions, university lectures, Friday prayers, sermons in churches, and any kind of prestigious or formal situation that you may think of. However, Ferguson left the door ajar in stating that there are actually different shapes in between these binary two forms, the dialect and the standard form. These shapes are different structural forms that range between the highest classical form and the lowest. Well, the definition of modern standard Arabic being a high prestigious form of Arabic with particular linguistic structures, phonological, morphological, and syntactic structures, cannot stand to the test of real life. Several attempts have been done after that, especially in 1960, Haim Blank, in 1973, Said Badawi, to make the definition of modern standard Arabic versus the modern dialects clearer and more structurally and functionally defined. This is how linguists of Arabic in the West approach the definition of modern standard Arabic. Now, Arab linguists themselves do not have a functional or a structural definition of what modern standard Arabic or its ancestor classical Arabic is. They have an ideological definition. To our colleagues in the Arab world, in language academies and in Arabic departments all over the Arab world, modern standard Arabic / classical Arabic is what they call Al-Arabiya, or Arabic. All the spoken dialects, all the written forms of the spoken dialects are approximations to that ideal, perfect, and correct form of Arabic. So to Arab linguists, and this is a very odd ideological definition, but it's a definition that seems to be undisputable in the Arab world so far. This is the form of perfection, and our dialects are simply incorrect. In fact, some of our colleagues still assume that whatever we are speaking is modern standard Arabic with little stylistic differences. Charles Ferguson had a meeting in Baghdad around 1985 or something with a colleague in Baghdad University who received a phone call from his wife and who was talking to his wife, of course, in Baghdad dialect. And when he hung up, Ferguson asked him what he was talking to his wife in, and the man said it was classical Arabic. Well, so we have a functional and structural definition of classical and modern standard Arabic, and we have an ideological definition. But if we actually want to study what modern standard Arabic is, and of course, if we want to see how modern standard Arabic developed in comparison to classical Arabic, we will see that we are faced with some problems. There is the problem of script. I will talk about it soon. There is a problem of identity. There is a problem of medium, the medium in which a text is being conveyed. There is a problem of correctness, and there is a problem of region. Now, to study how Arabic developed, we have to study texts, right? And here starts the problem. So whenever any scholar in the field, even those who work in the field of computational linguistics, have to make very tough and sometimes political decisions about the kind of text that they will process for data. Now, is this a text in modern standard Arabic? According to Ferguson's definition, I don't think it is. It is also not a text in modern standard Arabic according to an Arab ideologist. Less so here. Yet these and similar texts are quite recurrent in Arabic. Now, so our colleagues, and I faced this problem personally when I was in Radboud University working on my PhD. I had a part-time job working for a Dutch Arabic dictionary. And in one of our early preparation meetings, we wanted to see what is the source of data that we will harvest for our dictionary. And then we had to make up our own working definition of what modern standard Arabic is. Just our definition. So when we sat down to discuss that definition, we came up with this one. It's the variety of Arabic that all the Arabs use and understand in both mostly written and, in few cases, spoken Arabic all over the Arab world. When we excluded data that sounded to us a regionalism. So when you have somebody speaking, or when you have a written text that you could know the region or the country of the writer or the speaker, we excluded that. Now try to keep this definition in mind. We'll discuss it. I will go to the problem of script. Now, in the problem of script, you have essential problems like the absence of short vowels. In the Arabic script, there is no internal short vowel representation in the word. So, a word like this, istargil. This is a word that has several short vowels. So if you look at this first example here, so this word reads amk. This is a glottal stop, and this is the letter ma and ka. Amk. This is how you write the word your mother in Arabic. Amk. Glottal stop, the letter for ma, and a letter for ka. Okay. In classical Arabic, this word ummuka, ummuka, or in an easy modern standard Arabic, ummuk. In Egyptian Arabic, it's ummak. In the Massian Arabic, it's immak. Now, when you see this example, this is the word إمك. You cannot decide if it is written in Modern Standard Arabic, Classical Arabic, Egyptian Arabic, or Damascene Arabic. Okay, so this isn't just an example for the first problem of the absence of short vowels. Now, for long vowels, you have another problem. The written symbols for long vowels are also used for semivowels and glides. So if you go to dataset number 2, the long vowel E, as in aish, or live. So remember man up and live single? So this is aish, live. Okay. This E, long vowel E, can also be read here in this example. Here's Aish. And this is the E part. You can read it as Aish, or Aish, or Aish. 3 different words, 3 different meanings. And you come to infinite possibilities when you try to say that this is not Egyptian Arabic, this is Damascene Arabic or Modern Standard Arabic. Now, another problem of script when you see it is that there is in the dialects, the interdental sounds, tha and tha, go either into a sa, tha goes into a sa, or tha goes into a plosive ta. But they are written all with a tha. And the same thing also happens. Oh, this is the example here. So, thabt. So in Modern Standard Arabic, it's thabbit. Or, so when people are easy in pronunciation, they would say sabbit. Egyptian Arabic, it depends on your social class, sabbit or tabbit. In Damascene Arabic, it's the reverse, but it's also a social class marker, tabbit, thabbit, and sabbit. The larger the text, the more problems like this. The same problem happens with emphatic sounds like qa, qa. So that sound, that word is qalb, which means heart. So it's written in 3 letters, qa, la, and ba. The short vowel a, of course, is missing in writing, but it's in Standard Arabic qalb. In Egyptian Arabic, it's alb, but it's also written with a qaf, or galb, and it's also written with a qaf, and the same goes for Damascene. So as far as the sounds of the text you want to use for data are concerned, you have major problems trying to define which variety is that. Okay. Now, this was quickly the problem of script. In addition to that, which is something that I first heard early this morning, there are sometimes decisions that are made by publishers to use short vowel markers. And when they do, they usually use them on top, like this. And in the bottom. Once this decision is made, comes another problem. Because yes, we will be able to know if this is written in standard Arabic or in a dialect and which dialect, but we will have the problem of if the person who's writing this text is actually writing it in proper whatever form, proper modern standard Arabic or proper dialect. An average daily newspaper publication, for instance, uses 15 proofreaders on shift. Still, you can find mistakes. So this is the problem of script. Now, the problem of identity is quite relevant to the problem of script. Sometimes there is no way for us to know that the text at hand belongs either to modern standard Arabic, classical Arabic, or to a dialect of any form. Simply because vocabulary is identical, script is vague, and there is a very interesting yet unstudied degree of hypertextuality. So texts are blended within one another without markers of borrowing a text into another. Now, problems of identity now, you have to answer the question, is this particular text at hand a modern standard Arabic or classical Arabic or in any other dialect? Now, in the text, in a particular text, which is the second point, are all the parts of the text written at the same time? So for instance, the majority of Arabs are Muslims. And it's very prestigious to use either direct quotes from the Quran or classical texts, classical religious texts, or actually the forms of these texts without using their verbal form. So you use the structure, but you didn't use the words. So you could find, for instance, somebody who's giving you a sentence The first part of which, I'm using the word sentence loosely, first part of which is in modern standard Arabic Write, and the second part is a direct quote or an indirect quote from the Quran, for instance. There is no formal or structural way that you can make that distinction. In addition, our colleague Dilworth Parkinson is now working on an article about the use of, say, for instance, modern catchphrases in written texts. So an Egyptian who would be, for example, talking to you now in a lecture about the cold, he or she might very simply use a phrase from a movie in which the protagonist was feeling very cold. That phrase could be in Egyptian Arabic, could be in a regional variety of Egyptian Arabic. So these are three issues with the problem, in the problem of identity. Is the text, what variety of Arabic is this text? Is the whole text from the same variety? And if there is a text embedded in another text? No. Yeah. Now, what varieties of Arabic is it? Let me read this to you. الفيل في أول شارع النيل. الفيل في أول شارع النيل. The elephant is at the end of the Nile Street. This is not a Chomsky-like sentence, but this is a direct quote from a novel. And the al-fil, which is the elephant, is in fact not an animal, it's a nightclub. It's very strange to call a nightclub what it is. So, this sentence, al-fil fi awwal shara' al-Nil, is in fact impossible to define if this is classical Arabic sentence, a modern standard Arabic sentence, an Egyptian Arabic sentence, a Libyan Arabic sentence, an Algerian Arabic sentence, or even a North Nigerian Arabic sentence. Okay. Now, another example. This example is for a text directly quoted from a movie into a text. This is the title of an article that was published a few weeks ago to express the author's opinion about the new Egyptian constitution referendum. Reads, أنا في الطراوة. Literally, I am in humility. في الطراوة is a phrase that was first invented by a comedian named Adil Imam in a 1985 movie about the downfall of the Egyptian middle class, in which he used the phrase, the prepositional phrase, في الطراوة as an idiom meaning or referring to people who are destitute, have nothing to support them. Now, ana is the modern standard Arabic pronoun, first person singular, I. Fitarawa is that idiom, yes. But there is nothing in that idiom, structurally speaking, that would distinguish it from modern standard Arabic or classical. It is not expected that all linguists, historical linguists of Arabic, who are not Egyptian, who have not seen the movie, to be able to find out the idiomatic meaning of this prepositional phrase. Now, okay. I can't read that third example. But it's an example about borrowing. So in Arabic, when people borrow, they usually take that word they borrow, say from English, for instance, and put it in an Arabic form. So we Arabs borrowed, when the computers came out, we borrowed the verb to save a file into our form save. So that sentence that I cannot read for now has that similar phenomenon.
I can read for you.
Hmm?
I can read.
Can you?
It's supposed to be Arabic?
Yes.
ما في لعروشهم الطاير. Is that something like, is it Egyptian dialect?
Yes.
Because I'm Lebanese. Sometimes some dialect might be not for me. لعروشهم الطاير.
Yeah.
ما في
Oh, sorry. This is what. على رؤوسهم الطير.
على رؤوسهم الطير. ما في على رؤوسهم الطير.
Yeah.
طير دي. The bird. طير.
No, I made a problem. I made a mistake in writing down this example.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Doesn't
Okay.
make sense.
Now, whatever medium you get your data from, you may have structural differences. So for instance, we now have news websites for daily news publications. You have, for instance, اليوم السابع or الوطن newspaper that come out daily with a website that is updated every 2 minutes, for instance. If you look at a news piece on the website, it might have structural features that are different from the same news piece on the printed, published form. Now, this is from a Dastur newspaper. أب يتخلص من ابنتيه بعد أن ضبطهم يمارسن معاشرة المثل. So translated in very good English, a father gets rid of his 2 daughters after he caught them, plural, masculine, practice, plural, feminine, homosexuality. So, verb conjugations, pronouns is in an agreement salad. This is from a Dastur website, the same piece of news on the printed, published paper publication was very accurately structured.
Well, the English meaning, that's what comes.
Mm-hmm.
What was the English meaning? I read one of my books that was translated from English into Arabic, and they have exact translation, doesn't the context. Say, gets rid, disowned. The American people will never understand gets rid. That's used for other, you know what I mean? You say disown your daughters.
Yes.
For example, I'm saying that.
Yes, but the word I'm just translating it
exact,
literally.
Exact. Okay, that's what they have.
Literally.
literally. There's the something else I'm gonna ask. Excellent.
Well, what the man did was actually he killed his two daughters.
Yes, I think probably.
Yeah.
Not disown them. Yeah, okay.
No. Disowning them is a different word.
Professor,
Yeah.
does the number and gender markings in the parentheses both refer to the daughters?
Yes.
Okay.
So sometimes they have been mentioned in masculine, sometimes in feminine, sometimes in dual, sometimes in plural. Okay. Now becomes actually another decision that has to be made. Are these mistakes? So referring to the two daughters in plural masculine, is it a mistake? Or is it probably an Egyptian Arabic form? Because in modern standard Arabic and in classical Arabic, there is gender and number agreement. In Egyptian Arabic, and indeed in all the dialects of Arabic, there is only gender agreement, there is no number agreement. Now, is this a mistake? Or is this a form, or is this just interference from Egyptian Arabic? Or is this actually a sign of real innovation in modern standard Arabic? Okay. Now, also in the problem of medium, there is this correctness issue. There is regionalism. So you can identify, even when texts are very well written and structures are very good, well taken care of in modern standard Arabic, you know from a news website, for example, that this is an Algerian text. This is a Moroccan text. This is an Egyptian or a Syrian text. That is an issue of lexical borrowing or an issue of an emphasis on the use of particular structure and the negligence of other structures. Now, when the medium is spoken, when the medium is spoken Arabic, so a radio, a news bulletin, or something on Al Jazeera, you would be able to know from which country the speaker is, or at least from which region the speaker is. For instance, the modern standard Arabic sound ja. In Egyptian Arabic is ga. But Egyptian Arabs, when they use modern standard Arabic, even perfectly, they use the sound ga. You can also know a person who recites the Quran, you can also know their regional background. Okay. Now, interestingly, and there is a study that just came out few days ago from the corpus collected by our Utah colleagues in Brigham Young, stating that some pre-verbal particles, aspectual particles, are used in some Arab countries more than in other Arab countries, and are used in some kinds of publications more than in others. If this is quote unquote the case, if this is quote unquote an underlying true, then how can this be accounted for in any kind of data collection method? Okay. Finally, sources of lexical borrowing. Arabic borrows heavily from different languages in different fields. And interestingly, borrowing happens not by single words, but by semantic fields. So for instance, in Egyptian Arabic, when cafes, European style, were introduced into the country, the terms for cafes were borrowed from Italian. When particular European cheeses were introduced into the country in the late 19th century, they were introduced in Greek terminology, which dominated all borrowing in the grocery store area. Furniture words are borrowed from French, for instance. All technology words are borrowed from English, nothing from German. Interesting. My colleague Zuhair the other week touched on that and said that actually in Lebanon, the issue of borrowing is much more complicated than that. In a modern survey done in 2004, our colleague Peter Heath found that actually in Morocco, words in education and in computer sciences were borrowed from English, and all the other disciplines such as philosophy, economy, social sciences, they are all borrowed from French. Now, what does this mean? What does the source of a borrowed vocabulary item could do? We know, for instance, that Arabic up to the 50s did not have a va sound. So the Arabs would use the word for villa, they would say filla. We could record a steady advancement of the allophone va from the 80s. So people have video cassettes, if you still remember those. People would have villas, not villas anymore. Janet Watson in 2007 found that in Egyptian Arabic, 2 sounds on an allophonic status appeared in Egyptian Arabic over the last century, and these are the p, pa sound, and the va sound. The plosive pa and the fricative va. In Moroccan Arabic, there is a cha sound, which is borrowed directly from the Amazigh/Berber languages. So these are all issues that a historian of modern standard Arabic will have to make decisions about when they need to study the evolution of a form that's called modern standard Arabic, or see how classical Arabic behaves in its modern sense. Therefore, most of the research now is directed towards morphological and syntactic variation in modern standard Arabic, because it's the assumption, if we understand if we understand the mechanics of variation in modern standard Arabic, we will be able to find a suitable set of data that we can sit down and analyze for developmental purposes. Thank you very much.
comments.
Really? Thank you so much. Was very interesting. Dr. Sharkawi, I want to ask, what was the, I was wonder what century was the transfer? I mean, the transformation of the language, like the, let's say, the classical Quran language into the dialect language. When was it? I'm not a linguistic, political science, but I'm interested. When the dialect was starting to say Lebanese, Egyptian? By the way, the Egyptian dialect is my number one dialect. I like it so much. It's very musical, very, you could understand it easier than other dialects. I'm Lebanese. I find the Egyptian dialect is very easy to understand. I cannot understand the Moroccan dialect, Libyan sometimes. Because, when I watch the news, I find the Egyptian is more always understood to me at least. So when the dialect really starts replacing the classical one,
Well, that's a very good question, but in fact, the most recent edition of our understanding of the history of Arabic is that classical Arabic is an innovation of the dialects. So dialects are much more archaic than classical Arabic. So the variety in which the Quran was revealed is certainly much more recent than the ancestor variety of, say, Yemeni Arabic, which was the main dialect in Arabizing Egypt. Therefore, you'd see, for example, that standard Arabic, classical Arabic is much less, has much less archaic forms than Egyptian Arabic. Other questions?
So you said that there are more aspectual preverbal particles in some dialects than others. So that makes me wonder, is Arabic tense prominent or aspect prominent, and does it sort of have a continuum across the dialects?
Well, it has a continuum across the dialects, and this is a very, very open question. And in addition, what I said exactly was that some standard Arabic in some countries focuses more on particular pre-verbal markers than others. Other countries focus on other different pre-verbal markers than that first country. So there is a pool of pre-verbal markers. They all exist in classical and modern standard Arabic. Egyptian Arabic uses this set more than, say, Libyan Arabic. And Libyan Arabic uses forms that are more similar, for instance, to Mauritanian Arabic than forms used by Egyptian Arabic, although Egyptian Arabic and Libyan Arabic belong to the same dialect family. But it sounded like I gave generalizations, and I did. We have problems with these generalizations because we do not have, I would put it this way, we do not have enough trustworthy corpus-based generalizable data because we have problems building a proper corpus. And this is what I tried to make clear today. Go ahead.
Okay, I want to ask what has determined actually the basic sounds of Arabic in the modern standard Arabic. And you mentioned one sound like the qa sound, and it's shifted to the glottal stop in Egypt and in Syria, and I can see it's still the same in the even dialects in, for example, Oman, and it's the ga sound in my dialect of Saudi Arabia. So what has determined? Okay, well, this is the modern standard sound. Okay, it's the qa, and everything else is the allophones of that phoneme.
What determined that it is the modern standard Arabic sound?
Yeah.
Easy answer is that we found it in the books of traditional Arabic grammarians. So all the sounds that you could find an explanation for in the traditional Arabic books of grammar go into the canon as being the classical sounds. I did not give a historical background in the beginning, but classical Arabic, modern standard Arabic became to be a spoken form only when public education was introduced into the Arab world. It was only a written form before that. So the sounds that you could find in Sibawayh's book are those that you can consider sounds of classical Arabic and modern standard Arabic. Qaf is one of those. The glottal stop in Egyptian Arabic, the glottal stop allophone in Egyptian Arabic is what we see now and what we can study for Egyptian Arabic. But for classical Arabic, it's what you see in the books.
My next question, how do colonialism affects our language? For example, in Lebanon, I know people speak French more than Arabic and become like part. I know in Egypt, Khawaja is not a good word for
You think people
in Lebanon,
speak?
it's a good word, Khawaja.
You think?
Yeah.
Okay, now,
Mystery.
also people have an assumption that Moroccans use more French in their language than they use Arabic.
Common everyday language.
Yes, but this is also not true.
And Lebanon?
And now in Lebanon they speak perfect Arabic.
Oh,
Perfect dialect of Arabic. Yeah.
But they mix it like here.
Well, all the dialects of Arabic borrow, and they borrow heavily.
Oh, okay.
And English borrows heavily too. All the languages in the world
So
borrow.
it's borrowing more than effect in the language. That's what he's saying. The dialect. For example, in Lebanon, this man has a default. It's a defect in French, in
Yeah.
English. Default. It's not an Arabic word. It's French because we're under French. French were in Lebanon, British were in Egypt. So we have some little words that have connotation. So I told you Khawaja. Khawaja in Egyptian language is a very bad word. In Lebanese, Khawaja means gentleman. But because of the British colonialism, you know what I mean? In Egypt doesn't have a nice connotation. That's what I noticed at least when I went to the fish.
Yes. Yes, but still Egyptian Arabic borrows
Egyptian, of
heavily.
course,
Yeah.
yes. It's in the
All the dialects borrow. And standard Arabic borrowed. Actually, classical Arabic borrowed a lot. And if I may give just an example, you think that the language of the Quran is pure Arabic, right? But there are 4 or 5 books that we know from the 2nd century of the Islamic era that have huge lists of borrowed words in the Quran. Borrowing is a very natural phenomenon.
There's enrichment more than deficiency, you would say. I don't know. That's a linguistic.
Other question?
Do you notice has it been noticed at all since the introduction of sort of standardized education where modern Arabic is taught more systematically? Is there a convergence or divergence of any of these dialects?
Yeah, there is, but that has nothing, I think, to do with, has more to do with mass media than with education. Since the introduction of radio in Egypt in the 1920s, you could see actually more a standardization in Korean Arabic, for instance. And there is a standardization process in Damascene Arabic as well. And capitals in the Arab world tend to impose their dialects as standards. However, classical and modern standard Arabic should not be influenced by issues such as that. But they are. So for instance, the same sound qaf that I just used is in Korean Arabic a, and in rural Egyptian Arabic ga. So, but when Egyptians use standard Arabic as a spoken form, they use the Korean Arabic and they do not use the rural Arabic form. So there is a degree of going to even to a regional standard. But this is not education, this is more, I think, mass media. There is a very interesting book about mass media influence on Egyptian, a chapter has to do with mass media influence on Egyptian Arabic, and Walter Armbrust, Popular Culture and Modernism in Egypt. This book has been published by Oxford University Press, and its second edition just came out 2 years ago. It has very good sources in that, if you are interested.
What?
Popular Culture and Modernism in Egypt, Walter Armbrust, Oxford University Press.
Thank you.
Mohamed, when you characterized how Arabic linguists, Arabic scholars, viewed the relationship between standard classical Arabic and the dialects, you said there is an ideological position. But somehow it sounded very much like the way in which Saussure characterized the relationship between Lang and Paral. But I'm not sure that calling this an ideological difference is something that just explain that part, because it sounds very much like your colleagues see a kind of a Lang-Paral relationship, but
our colleagues in the Arab world think that whatever, for instance, when they are talking to their students in their lecture halls, they are using Al-Arabi Arabic, which is what we call classical modern standard Arabic. But they do not. Our colleague from Georgetown, Amin Bunda, actually recorded mosque sermons, church sermons, and university lectures, going for the possessive structure in modern standard Arabic, classical Arabic. And he, in fact, found that there is a statistically significant tendency in these traditionally classical modern standard Arabic functions to statistically significant results that show that they use actually Egyptian Arabic forms of the possessive structure. So their assumption is that they are using proper Arabic. But the difference between what we study in books of grammar about modern standard Arabic or classical Arabic and what we produce is, in fact, yes, the difference between Lang and Paral in the Saussurian sense. Yes, because we all, when we write in modern standard Arabic, and I may notice this, my last book, which was published a few months ago, had actually to wait for 1.5 years for editors. It has been reviewed linguistically 5 times. And I call myself a good person in writing Arabic. Yes, I know all the traditional grammar rules, and I know how to write in Arabic, and I take pride in that. But yes, so all what there is in the books is long, and what we produce is Paral. Yes, but if we assume that what we are producing is perfect classical modern standard Arabic, that's a different issue.
so that's the ideological
Yeah.
issue.
I'm going to be kind of bold here because I about a decade or so ago, I tried learning Arabic, and
That's a tough decision.
it was the toughest thing I've ever done. But I remember a lecture from the instructor about a relationship between pre-Islamic poetry and the Arabic language. And is that true? Is there a connection between that? And I always wondered in my mind, was there, because of all that historical background with Islam and poetry and all that, did that impact the language? Is that relation, is that really existing, or is that just a historical connection that people make that just learning Arabic?
The relationship between pre-Islamic poetry and the Quran is that both varieties have a case system. Pre-Islamic dialects, we're actually moving away from a fully functional case system during the time of revelation. And of course, the ancestors of modern dialects of Arabic have lost the case system. But the common structural aspect between pre-Islamic poetry and the Quran is the case system.
Is what, I'm sorry?
The case system, that these two varieties have grammatical case. That is the only salient feature that these two varieties have in opposition to the rest of the Arabic dialects.